The Fourth Authority by Dr. Alon Giladi. The Fourth Authority and the Concept of Authority.
After I have reviewed the general and democratic liberal background for the establishment of the social authority, it is appropriate to give preliminary consideration to the conceptual essence of the authority itself, in itself and in relation to the other authorities within the framework of the state complex. The question standing here for discussion is in fact why there is a place from a conceptual general perspective to establish an additional authority, parallel to the existing authorities in the state, which will be required for a certain specific issue. Why is there a place for the establishment of an authority, which is an institution whose justification is supposed to be principled and normative from the highest basic level, whose subject concerns the entire population for the purpose of solving a specific problem or the problem of a specific sector? For it is not within the realm of possibility to allow every sector, as important as it may be, to develop an independent authority parallel to the three basic authorities for the solution of its problems. The claim at the base of our discussion will be, therefore, that the fourth authority comes to protect the interests of the middle and lower classes from a socio-economic perspective, and hence, by definition, it does not operate toward or for the benefit of the entire population, but toward a certain part of it, and therefore, from a conceptual perspective, it is devoid of legitimacy from the accepted perspective for the state and its authorities. To what is this similar? To the public education sector, which would demand, because of the deteriorating situation of the youth or the situation of the teacher's level, to establish an independent authority of its own. Or, for example, to the minority sector in every society, ethnic or national, which would seek to solve problems of deprivation and others within the framework of establishing an additional authority. Or an economic sector such as the small self-employed, who would seek to be addressed regarding the issue of the closing of thousands of small businesses and the collapse of the small self-employed class in the face of the large corporations. Or the health system, whose representatives would come and demand a cure for the brain drain to the private sector or to other countries, leaving most of the population devoid of proper treatment, let alone rapid, lacking the ability to insure itself with private insurances, or to receive necessary medicines in critical situations, and so on and so forth. The situation is fundamentally different regarding the functioning of the other authorities, which are each entrusted with another field from the comprehensive general fields of life of the entire population: legislation, execution, and adjudication. I cannot accept this claim. My answer within the framework of the introduction will be made with reference to the basic thought of central and classical thinkers, possessing an approach that can be called liberal from the economic field, regarding the institutional structure of the state that includes authorities, in order to examine what an authority is and whether the fourth authority is included in this concept, in the democratic liberal society. An examination of the philosophical thought of central scholars reveals different philosophical perceptions in relation to the basic institutional structure of the state. In a general way, it can be said that the search for an answer in this matter is done usually by checking the identity of the source of authority of the state's institutions, or in other words, of the sovereign, alongside the examination of the purpose of the granting of authority, of that act which constitutes the basic institutions in the state, in such or another order between the two. Another common denominator is that the purpose required by the thinkers is always a general purpose, directed at the general population given in society, and which the thinkers were required to characterize its essence.
Hobbes, the security of the individual and the absolute specific sovereign.
The general social purpose was explained by Hobbes as the security of the individual. The public chooses to avoid or disconnect from a natural state of a war of all against all, and this by establishing a social contract, or by natural force. According to this contract, all individuals transfer to the sovereign ruler, whether a single person or an assembly, all their power and strength, and this in an irrevocable manner. That sovereign, who is absolute by virtue of this total and irrevocable transfer, embodies within him the personality of those transferring, and acts for their security through public officials, and not through independent authorities. These officials execute the will of the absolute ruler-sovereign through legislation, adjudication, and execution. Hobbes divides the officials into different types, such as officials for general administration, appointed over the entire estate of the land, or part of it such as a regent, guardian, governor, etc. Officials for special administration, appointed over roles related to some special occupation in the land, such as economy, treasury, taxation, levies, etc. And outside the land, such as in matters of the people's army, and all of whom serve the representing sovereign personality. Officials for education, officials for adjudication. Also those to whom adjudication is given are public officials, for in their sitting on the seat of judgment, they represent the personality of the sovereign, and their judgment is his judgment. Every adjudication is essentially attached to sovereignty, and therefore all other judges are but officials of the holder, or holders, of sovereign power. Also regarding execution, officials operate whose power of attorney in their hand is given from the sovereign to bring about the execution of judgments, to publish the sovereign's commands, to suppress riots, to seize and imprison offenders, and to perform other actions whose purpose is the preservation of peace. The authority of the public officialdom, according to Hobbes, originates, therefore, in the absolute ruler, in the sovereign. Their governmental status toward the ruler is as officials with power of attorney to carry out his word. The principles according to which they operate are first and foremost the preservation of peace and civil security, which is the purpose of the entire political regime. The concept of authority is not accepted by Hobbes. In fact, the authority is only the absolute ruler, who is a specific personality, individual or assembly, to whom the citizens gave all their power and rights in an irrevocable manner, to avoid the war of all against all. The citizens are the subjects of the sovereign, and the public officialdom is his proxy to carry out his word and his word alone. Not only this, Hobbes's reference to a government with authorities is extremely negative and saturated with truly sharp remarks. Sometimes, even in a purely political government, there is more than one soul. For example, when the authority to impose taxes, likened to the power of the nourishing soul, depends on a general assembly, the authority to lead and command, likened to the moving power, in one person, and the authority to legislate laws, likened to the power of the rational soul, in the accidental consent not only of these two, but even of a third body. This endangers the commonwealth. Even those few who grasp that such a government is not a government, but the division of the commonwealth into three factions, nevertheless call this a mixed monarchy. But the truth is that this is not an independent commonwealth, but three independent factions. It is not one representing personality, but three. If the king bears the personality of the people, and the General Assembly also bears the personality of the people, and the other assembly bears the personality of part of the people, then they are not one personality nor one sovereign, but three kinds of personality and three sovereigns. Which disease in the natural body of a man I could liken to this irregularity of a commonwealth? This I do not know. But I have seen a man from whose one side grew and developed another man, having a head, arms, chest, and stomach of his own. If from his other side had grown and developed another man, perhaps a precise comparison would have been given to us. And from here, one can learn about the concept of authority according to Hobbes. The authority is an independent institution bearing the personality of the people or its part. Since all the power and strength of the citizens are transferred to a specific personality, king or assembly, in an irrevocable manner, the authority of the absolute ruler is not given and must not be given to any division by the very essence of its establishment.
Therefore, there is no place for authorities, independent institutions which actually involve a division of sovereignty, which is indivisible by definition. Furthermore, there is no need for an institution of the authority type, since one can at any and every time, regarding any and every situation, turn to the sovereign personality or assembly, ask its opinion, and receive its guidance. The absolute ruler is the sovereign,
the possessor of authority and the delegator of authority for the action of his officials toward all the citizens who are his subjects, while he is subject to one and only supreme principle at the base of the social contract which established them, and that is the security of the individual. Only from the moment he does not fulfill this supreme rule can and even should he be replaced. However, in a remark that perhaps looks toward the future use of the concept of authority, Hobbes lingers at the end of the institutional chapter in his book regarding the sovereign's advisors, or the Council of State. These are not held by him as public officials, since they are not only givers of advice toward the sovereign when it is required, but they are always also possessors of the authority of adjudication or command. Furthermore, since their advice is directed to the sovereign alone, it is not possible that in his presence his personality be represented toward him by another. Nevertheless, there is never a council of advisors without some other authority in its hand, whether of adjudication or of actual administration. As far as the rule of the people is concerned, Hobbes believes that this council, or the Senate as he says, informs the people of the results of its consultation as a council. But regarding the appointment of judges, or in a court session, or receiving ambassadors, it is in the nature of an official of the people. As far as the rule of the nobility is concerned, the Council of State is the sovereign itself, and it does not give advice except to itself, while in an individual rule it represents the ruler by handing over his commands to the public officials. It seems, therefore, that precisely at the end of the analysis of the status of the sovereign's representatives, Hobbes is caught, apparently, in a short deliberation regarding the structure of the government and its institutions in societies where the rule of the people is led, as distinguished from the specific absolute ruler, individual or assembly, which is the main part of his interest and the reality of his life. It can, in my opinion, be argued that this remark implicitly calls for completion or correction at another time regarding the institutional matter, certainly as far as the rule of the people is concerned.
Locke. The people as non-specific sovereign, and the authorities as expression and execution of its constitutive and ongoing will.
A correction to Hobbes's view is reflected in the thought of Locke, who discusses the institutions of the state where the sovereign is not a specific personality. Locke expands the purpose of establishing the regime while attacking Hobbes's basic assumptions as well as his conclusions. The establishment of the social contract turns the constitutive people into the sovereign and not the ruler, who is its trustee, its representative. The basic purpose of this establishment is not regarding the war of all against all, but the will to preserve the basic natural rights of the individual, which are life, liberty, and property, which the individual finds difficult to preserve alone. Therefore, we do not have before us a transfer of the rights themselves, but of the individual's powers in their comprehensive form, to his trustee, to the state authorities, in order to preserve them through the power to legislate, to judge, and to execute, which exists in the state of nature within every individual. And so that same trustee will act in a manner that fulfills the purpose of the contract. He cannot be seen as the official of the ruler, who might act for the benefit of the ruler, and not for the benefit of the whole people. The governor turns, therefore, from the center of political existence to the agent of the people, of all the individuals. Therefore, the establishment of a legislative authority is required, which will legislate laws for the non-specific individual, that is, for the benefit of the entire society. This authority will also appoint judges who will judge without bias. When men establish a society, the main purpose before them is that they may enjoy their property in peace and security, and the main instrument and means for this purpose are the laws set in that society. Since this is so, the first and fundamental express law set in every community is the establishment of the legislative authority, just as the first and fundamental natural law, which binds the legislative authority itself, is the preservation of the society, and also, to the extent that this is consistent with the public good, of every person within it. This legislative power is not only the supreme authority within the community, but is sacred and unalterable in the hands of those to whom the community delivered it. And no command given by anyone else, whatever its form may be, or whatever the power supporting it may be, can possibly have the force and obligation of a law, as long as it does not have approval from that same legislative authority which the public chose and appointed. From here it also follows that the legislative authority, although it is supreme in the life of every community, does not have absolute arbitrary control over the life and property of the people, and this because it is nothing but the joint authority of all the members of society delivered into the hand of that legislator. The legislative authority is not permitted to take for itself authority, for example, by arbitrary commands every other day, but must do justice and decide regarding rights according to fixed laws that have been proclaimed and with the help of authorized and publicly known judges. Furthermore, the supreme authority is not entitled to take from any person any part of his property without his consent, and is not permitted to deliver into the hand of another the authority to legislate laws. Since this authority is but a deposit from the hands of the people alone can determine the form of the commonwealth by establishing the legislative authority and determining in whose hand it shall be placed. The attitude of the supreme legislative authority toward the citizens must be one law for the rich and for the poor, for the one close to the crown and for the peasant plowing his field. One and only final purpose for the law, which is the good of the people, including a prohibition on the imposition of taxes on the people's property without the expression of their consent to it, whether by themselves or by their emissaries. Alongside the supreme authority which expresses the will of the people and preserves the basic rights of the individual, the establishment of an executive authority is required, which is divided into two authorities: executive toward the interior and federative, executive toward the exterior. The executive authority is vital since laws are legislated once and in a short period of time, and they have fixed and permanent force, but they need constant execution or handling. Therefore, an authority is required which will care for the execution of the laws that are legislated and remain in force, and so that these representatives of the public will act for the benefit of the public and not for the benefit of a specific sector or individual. Locke seeks to separate them in a way that the personality of the legislators shall be separate from the personality of the executive authority, while in the parts of the executive authority itself, it is not possible, in his opinion, to separate the persons manning them. As mentioned, the authority, according to Locke, is not an officialdom subject to a specific personality, such as the monarch, or an assembly that is an absolute sovereign, but it possesses a quasi-sovereign dimension in that it constitutes the long arm of the people. For the sovereign, the people, cannot act in a practical manner except for a few moments or in an indirect manner for the constant existence of the social contract it made, except through an authority. The authority is not in the nature of an officialdom subject to the ruler, but is the institution whose goal is to fulfill the basic purpose of the social contract, that is, the preservation of the life, liberty, and property of all the citizens, who deposited the power found in the hands of each and every one of them for this purpose into its hands in trust. The concept of authority can therefore be extracted from Locke's thought as follows. The authority is not the sovereign. It is an independent institution entrusted with the preservation of the fundamental principles of society: liberty, property, and life, and this by giving expression to the will of the sovereign, the people individuals, through the legislation of laws and their execution. The power of the authority stems from the original basic powers of the individual, that is, legislation, execution, and adjudication, which are given to it as a deposit, as a trust from the sovereign, for the purpose of fulfilling the basic social purpose. Therefore, it is recommended to establish a legislative authority that shall be supreme in relation to the others, which is the one that brings the will of the people into expression through laws, subject to the constitutive purpose, as well as an authority that executes the laws toward the exterior and interior, and is subject to them. The manning of these authorities and the manner of their functioning is a derivative of their roles, in accordance with the purpose of the social contract. The form of the authority, including the manner of its division into several authorities, is determined by the people by law, in a way in which their basic, contract purpose and ongoing will shall come into expression and optimal execution. Therefore, where the authority does not fulfill the purpose of the contract, the justification to change it arises. The power of the authority is given to it, therefore, from the sovereign, from the people, and the scope of its operation is found in the purpose of the social contract. Its means of operation are derived from those natural powers that were the possession of the individual, and which served him for the protection of his natural rights. From the source of the authority's power, the people, from the supreme principles of society, life, liberty, and property, and from the natural means of the individuals, legislation, adjudication, execution. Locke learns about the division of authorities required in his view in the state. And yet Locke is aware of the danger in placing power in the hands of the representatives of the people, which might be channeled to their private benefit, contrary to the purpose of society and the government. Therefore, he proposes that the legislative authority shall not exist at all times. Since the laws have force at all times, and they can be legislated in a short period of time, the community will give into the hands of some persons the power of authority to legislate. These will gather according to law, and once they have finished their work, they shall return each man to his home, and become subject themselves to the laws they legislated. Locke addresses the basis of the establishment of the legislative authority in the state, its source of power, its purpose. But in all that concerns the structure of the authority which will allow its operation for the good of the whole, and not for the private benefit of its people, or of such or another sector, his analysis apparently lacks. The source of the legislative authority's power is in the people. It is composed through the choice of the citizens, gathers from time to time and disperses while leaving fixed laws that bind the entire population. However, Locke does not address the mechanism of the gathering of the legislative authority, how its practical gathering is determined, how its representatives are chosen, etc., and especially what will be its manner of operation in the face of the executive authority. This he does not address. True, he points to the need for the separation of personality between the executive and legislative authority. True, it seems that the source of power of the executive authority is the people, but he avoids discussing this in an explicit manner. Especially, he does not address the manner in which those persons of the executive authority will be chosen to fill their roles. He does not explain who and how will choose them, in whose hand the authority to dismiss them will be, how the activity of the executive authority will be limited in practice for the purpose of preventing arbitrariness. This is beyond the claim that the laws will limit the framework of its operation. Why that same executive authority, which exists in a constant manner, as distinguished from the legislative, while having such an enormous power toward it, will not take over the affairs of the whole and turn them into the private affairs of its people, or of those close to its table, or whose people are close to their table. The form of the authority, including the manner of its division into several authorities, is determined by the people by law, in a way in which their basic, contract purpose and ongoing will shall come into expression and optimal execution. Therefore, where the authority does not fulfill the purpose of the contract, the justification to change it arises. The power of the authority is given to it, therefore, from the sovereign, from the people, and the scope of its operation is found in the purpose of the social contract. Its means of operation are derived from those natural powers that were the possession of the individual, and which served him for the protection of his natural rights. From the source of the authority's power, the people, from the supreme principles of society, life, liberty, and property, and from the natural means of the individuals, legislation, adjudication, execution. Locke learns about the division of authorities required in his view in the state. And yet Locke is aware of the danger in placing power in the hands of the representatives of the people, which might be channeled to their private benefit, contrary to the purpose of society and the government. Therefore, he proposes that the legislative authority shall not exist at all times. Since the laws have force at all times, and they can be legislated in a short period of time, the community will give into the hands of some persons the power of authority to legislate. These will gather according to law, and once they have finished their work, they shall return each man to his home, and become subject themselves to the laws they legislated. Locke addresses the basis of the establishment of the legislative authority in the state, its source of power, its purpose. But in all that concerns the structure of the authority which will allow its operation for the good of the whole, and not for the private benefit of its people, or of such or another sector, his analysis apparently lacks. The source of the legislative authority's power is in the people. It is composed through the choice of the citizens, gathers from time to time and disperses while leaving fixed laws that bind the entire population. However, Locke does not address the mechanism of the gathering of the legislative authority, how its practical gathering is determined, how its representatives are chosen, etc., and especially what will be its manner of operation in the face of the executive authority. This he does not address. True, he points to the need for the separation of personality between the executive and legislative authority. True, it seems that the source of power of the executive authority is the people, but he avoids discussing this in an explicit manner. Especially, he does not address the manner in which those persons of the executive authority will be chosen to fill their roles. He does not explain who and how will choose them, in whose hand the authority to dismiss them will be, how the activity of the executive authority will be limited in practice for the purpose of preventing arbitrariness. This is beyond the claim that the laws will limit the framework of its operation. Why that same executive authority, which exists in a constant manner, as distinguished from the legislative, while having such an enormous power toward it, will not take over the affairs of the whole and turn them into the private affairs of its people, or of those close to its table, or whose people are close to their table.
Montesquieu. Adjusted roles for social strata and the separation of powers for the fulfillment of the principle of liberty.
Montesquieu enters this issue in greater detail in the 11th book within the framework of The Spirit of the Laws, regarding the connection between political liberty and the foundations of the regime. Montesquieu determines, following Locke and as a basic assumption, that in every state there exist three authorities of government: the legislative, the one executing things concerning the law of nations, foreign affairs, and the one executing things related to civil law, internal affairs. Through the legislative authority, the ruler sets temporary laws or permanent laws and amends or cancels past laws. Through the second authority, he acts in matters of security and foreign affairs, and through the third authority, he punishes for crimes or also decides in disputes between individuals. The latter authority he calls, as distinguished from Locke, the judicial, and the former, simply the executive authority of the state. From here, Montesquieu is required to the manner in which it can be ensured that the operation of these authorities shall be for the benefit of the whole and not for the benefit of the private interest of the ruler, whether an individual or a group. In his view, that same general danger of the abuse of power is true for every type of regime and can be prevented in a way that power shall check power, that is, an authority checks an authority. The foundations of the regime may be arranged so that no man shall be compelled to do things which the law does not oblige him to do, and shall not be prevented from doing things which the law permits him, when in the hands of one man, or in the hands of one group of magistrates, there reside the legislative authority and the executive authority as one. There is no liberty because there is room for fear that this monarch or this council will legislate tyrannical laws for the purpose of executing them in a tyrannical way. And even while addressing in practice Locke's division of powers, so too, if the judicial authority is not separated from the legislative and from the executive. In combination with the legislative authority, the judicial authority is liable to use its power in an arbitrary way and to harm the lives and liberties of the citizens, because the judge becomes in such a case a legislator. In combination with the executive authority,
the judge is liable to exploit his power for the sake of oppression. Faithful to the negation of the concentration of power in the hands of one ruler, Montesquieu turns to an analysis of the manner of operation of the separate authorities, which he required from the outset. The judicial authority is not to be given into the hands of a permanent council, but it needs to be operated by people who shall be chosen from among the people, as a temporary court that exists as long as it is needed for the purpose for which it was established. In such a way, the authority to judge will not be attached to a certain status or to a certain profession, and will become invisible and non-existent. Thus, you have no judges before your eyes constantly, and the fear felt is toward the governing office and not toward the office holders. Moreover, in major trials dealing with severe accusations, it is necessary that the criminal be able to choose, in accordance with the law, his judges, or at least be able to disqualify a large number from among those proposed as judges, until there remain those who can be seen as judges to his taste. Conversely, the judgments need to be fixed and in accordance with the law only, and not in accordance with the private opinion of the judge. As for the legislative and executive authority, Montesquieu believes that they should be placed in the hands of bodies or magistrates serving in a permanent manner, because they are not operated toward an individual in the state as such. The legislative authority is an expression of the general will in the state, and the second is the execution of this general will. Furthermore, according to Montesquieu, it is fitting that in the hands of the people, as a body, shall be the legislative power, since in a free state, every man is considered to possess a free soul and is supposed to be ruled by himself. Since this is not possible in large states, and there is fear also of many defects in small states, it is necessary that the people shall do through its representatives that which it cannot do by itself. And since a man knows the needs of his city better than the needs of other cities, it is fitting that the members of the legislative body be chosen in a local manner. That is, that in every main place the residents shall choose from among themselves a representative.
The advantage of the representatives lies in that there is in their hands the ability to discuss public affairs, whereas the people, in a collective manner, is not suitable for this. The representatives are obligated to give an account to those who sent them, but as distinguished from a general instruction from the voters, there is no obligation to consult them on each and every matter. This consultation is indeed a more faithful expression of the voice of the people, but it lengthens to infinity the discussions, and all the power of the nation may crumble due to the whim of this or that representative who has in his hand the power to delay and cancel a decision-making process, let alone at the time of need for a quick decision. Montesquieu seeks to apply the principle of the separation of powers in relation to the existing regime of his time, apparently not from a starting point of protecting the weak, the majority of the people, but specifically the strong, the nobility and the monarch, according to a structure similar to that which Hegel will later call constitutional monarchy. In his taste, the legislative power needs to be deposited in the hands of a body that shall be chosen to represent the people, and in the hands of a body of nobles. The reason for this need is that there are always in the state men of a more important position, by virtue of their origin or their wealth, etc. These two houses of representatives shall be separate, having their own discussions, separate views and interests. Since the membership in the House of Representatives of the nobility needs to pass by inheritance, because of the nature of nobility and the preservation of its special rights, which according to him arouse in themselves loathing and are in constant danger in the free state, and since a governing authority received by inheritance leads to the adherence to the private interests of the class, and to the forgetting of the needs of the people, it is necessary that in things in which they have a clear interest to act in a corrupt manner, such as laws for the collection of taxes, this authority shall not have a hand in legislation, except as a factor having a right of prevention, but not as a factor having a right of decision. As for the executive authority, this should, in his opinion, always be in the hands of the monarch, because here almost always immediate action is required, according to changing circumstances, and this matter is managed better by a single person than by several, as distinguished from the legislative authority. Furthermore,
Montesquieu argues that the legislative body does not need to exist continuously, since the overemployment of the executive authority will cause it to give its mind to the protection of its special rights, and the very authority to execute, and not to the execution itself. In his view, a legislative body existing continuously is liable to reach the point of indifference or corruption or violence. Likewise, the legislator should not convene by its own decision, for a body in the political system is not supposed to possess a will except when convened. If the decision regarding the convening were in the hands of the legislator, then it is possible it would postpone its convening forever, and thereby a danger would exist of an assassination of the executive authority. Montesquieu's solution to this important matter is not that the will of the people shall determine the time of convening, but in accordance with the old order, the executive authority, which is, after all, in the control of the monarch. This authority is the one that shall choose the time of convening and its duration according to the circumstances known to it. The executive authority must have a right to check the initiatives of the legislative body, for otherwise it will become despotic. The power of prevention is different from the power of legislation itself. On the other hand, if the monarch were to take part in legislation through a power of decision, there would no longer be liberty. Since the source of the monarch's power in legislation is the protection of himself, then it is fitting that this be a preventive power only. Montesquieu is careful and argues, and in my opinion, through a continuous contradiction inviting correction, that it is not desirable that the legislative authority have the possibility to check the executive authority, for the process of execution has limits by its very nature, and it is superfluous to limit it, especially since the executive authority always acts according to the changing needs of the hour. The laws set by this authority will be executed by the executive authority, but it is not within its power to judge the personality of the executor, which it is fitting should be sacred because of him being vital to the state, as one who does not allow the legislator to become a tyrant. Therefore, once he is accused or judged, there will no longer be liberty. The basic structure of the authorities, proposed by Montesquieu out of a desire for the preservation of liberty, is therefore of a legislative body composed of two houses, limiting each other through a mutual right of prevention, with a preference in issues such as taxation for the people's house over the house of nobility. These houses are restrained by the executive authority, which shall be itself restrained by the legislative authority. The status of the judicial authority regarding checks and balances is of less status than that of the other two authorities. His proposal for the institutional structure of the state constitutes a continuation of the trend of escaping from the structure of the Old World, especially in the European continent, toward the new trends reflected from the thought of Locke. The source of the authority's power, the sovereign, is not the monarch alone, or the people alone, or the nobility alone, but all these jointly and separately. The people is the source of power for one of the two legislative houses, including supreme power regarding taxation, the nobility for the additional house, and the monarch, whose power is given to him by inheritance, is entrusted with the executive aspect of the state's laws toward the interior and exterior. As far as things concern the principle of liberty, Montesquieu's solution for the combination between the old monarchical world and the rule of the people is through that same principle of the representation of the forces in society through their institutional separation, both in terms of their areas of activity and regarding their source of power. From here, one can address the concept of authority according to Montesquieu's perception. Montesquieu actually accepts Locke's concept of authority and its basic form in the context of the principle of liberty, with one fundamental difference or completion, and that is that the general will in the state stems from the will of the people according to its division into social legal layers, that is, the will of the estates, the people, the nobility, and the monarch. Montesquieu sees as a factual given the basic division of the authorities, legislative, executive, and judicial. Although he addresses the possibility of a specific and detailed division compared to Locke, as well as to the composition and manner of operation of the authorities toward each other, adjusted to the nature of their source of power and the basic social purpose of the society, such as, for example, liberty. A social purpose of the liberty type necessitates the existence of independent and separate authorities, in the flexible sense, in accordance with their role and the social layer entrusted with them, as well as the existence of mutual relations of checks and balances to prevent the tyranny of one social layer over the other. The executive authority must have a right to check the initiatives of the legislative body, for otherwise it will become despotic. The power of prevention is different from the power of legislation itself. On the other hand, if the monarch were to take part in legislation through a power of decision, there would no longer be liberty. Since the source of the monarch's power in legislation is the protection of himself, then it is fitting that this be a preventive power only. Montesquieu is careful and argues, and in my opinion, through a continuous contradiction inviting correction, that it is not desirable that the legislative authority have the possibility to check the executive authority, for the process of execution has limits by its very nature, and it is superfluous to limit it, especially since the executive authority always acts according to the changing needs of the hour. The laws set by this authority will be executed by the executive authority, but it is not within its power to judge the personality of the executor, which it is fitting should be sacred because of him being vital to the state, as one who does not allow the legislator to become a tyrant. Therefore, once he is accused or judged, there will no longer be liberty. The basic structure of the authorities, proposed by Montesquieu out of a desire for the preservation of liberty, is therefore of a legislative body composed of two houses, limiting each other through a mutual right of prevention, with a preference in issues such as taxation for the people's house over the house of nobility. These houses are restrained by the executive authority, which shall be itself restrained by the legislative authority. The status of the judicial authority regarding checks and balances is of less status than that of the other two authorities. His proposal for the institutional structure of the state constitutes a continuation of the trend of escaping from the structure of the Old World, especially in the European continent, toward the new trends reflected from the thought of Locke. The source of the authority's power, the sovereign, is not the monarch alone, or the people alone, or the nobility alone, but all these jointly and separately. The people is the source of power for one of the two legislative houses, including supreme power regarding taxation, the nobility for the additional house, and the monarch, whose power is given to him by inheritance, is entrusted with the executive aspect of the state's laws toward the interior and exterior. As far as things concern the principle of liberty, Montesquieu's solution for the combination between the old monarchical world and the rule of the people is through that same principle of the representation of the forces in society through their institutional separation, both in terms of their areas of activity and regarding their source of power. From here, one can address the concept of authority according to Montesquieu's perception. Montesquieu actually accepts Locke's concept of authority and its basic form in the context of the principle of liberty, with one fundamental difference or completion, and that is that the general will in the state stems from the will of the people according to its division into social legal layers, that is, the will of the estates, the people, the nobility, and the monarch. Montesquieu sees as a factual given the basic division of the authorities, legislative, executive, and judicial. Although he addresses the possibility of a specific and detailed division compared to Locke, as well as to the composition and manner of operation of the authorities toward each other, adjusted to the nature of their source of power and the basic social purpose of the society, such as, for example, liberty. A social purpose of the liberty type necessitates the existence of independent and separate authorities, in the flexible sense, in accordance with their role and the social layer entrusted with them, as well as the existence of mutual relations of checks and balances to prevent the tyranny of one social layer over the other.
Rousseau, The Authority in an Era of Liberty, Equality, and the Non-Specific Sovereign, the People.
Rousseau points to the problematic nature reflected in Montesquieu's view in an emphasized manner, even when he refers to that same England, in which, according to him, the people are in slavery, no more and no less, during all the time, except for that moment when it approaches the elections once every few years. In practice, the sovereign is not the people, but its representatives. To solve that same deficiency reflected in Montesquieu's thought, precisely in the context of actual liberty, that same problem of the citizens' chains, of the hypocrisy regarding their liberty, which does not exist in practice, and the implication for the essence of the institutions intended to provide this liberty, Rousseau turns to the roots of his predecessors' analyses, confronts them, and seeks to correct them. The individual's liberty includes his right to life, but also the right to property, which does not sit well with the situation in practice, since property is not given to the whole people, and what you do not have, you cannot ask that they preserve. The rights according to Locke undergo a change toward general principles of liberty and equality, moral and legal, which are what stand at the base of the entire social system. The preservation of this integrated purpose will not be possible when every man acts out of his own private self-interest, and so too his representatives. The proof is that even in the England of Locke, and certainly in the France divided into constitutional estates of Montesquieu, the existence of liberty and equality for the individuals in themselves cannot be shown. The people as sovereign and its representatives as its emissaries become an empty letter, semantics requiring a renewed examination. Rousseau opposes in a principled way the division of authorities accepted by Locke and Montesquieu, because in practice, it does not maintain the individual's liberty, and in a way, both theoretical and practical, it creates sovereignty for the ruler, while the true sovereign, the people, is disconnected from the decisions regarding its fate. Man is not free since he serves in practice as a subject and does not control his fate, while by definition, he is the sovereign. Therefore, and in order to apply the principles at the base of the society's purpose in a real way, and not as an empty letter, there is a need for the establishment of a process of transferring power to the government, which shall be different from that practiced in reality, and does not allow the proper result, which is the sovereignty of the people itself over itself. The first and most important conclusion is that only the general will can manage the powers of the state in accordance with the goal for which it was founded, namely, the good of the whole. For if the conflict between private interests necessitated the establishment of societies, then the agreement between those same interests caused this thing to be within the realm of possibility. I say, therefore, that since sovereignty is nothing but the execution of the general will, it can never be handed over to another, and the sovereign, which is but a collective creature, only it itself can serve as a representative to itself. For power can be handed over, but not the will. And truly, even if it is not impossible for a certain private will to be compatible at some point with the general will, it is at any rate impossible for this compatibility to be permanent and constant. For the private will tends by its nature to bias, while the general will tends to equality. And since the identity of the ruler and the identity of the sovereign should not be separated, for eventually the ruler becomes the sovereign in practice, there is also no distinguishing between different sovereigns within the framework of the state's unity, as in Montesquieu's proposal for the combination between the monarch, the nobility, and the people. Therefore, Rousseau opens with a very sharp attack, similar to Hobbes, on the subject of the division into authorities. However, since our scholars in political theory cannot divide sovereignty in its foundation, they divide it in its subject. They divide it into power and will, into a legislative authority and an executive authority, into rights of imposing taxes, of judgment, and of war. Sometimes they mix all these parts, and sometimes they separate between them. They turn the sovereign into an imaginary creature made of parts joined together. The matter is similar to as if they created a human being by a composition of different bodies, of which to one eyes only, to the second hands only, to the third feet only, and so all the rest. They say that the sorcerers of Japan cut children into pieces before the public. Afterward, they throw in the air all the limbs one by one, and the child falls to the ground alive and whole. Of this type, approximately, are the acts of sleight of hand of our scholars engaged in political theory. Hence, sovereignty is not divided into authorities, and the rights perceived as parts of the sovereignty are all in practice subject to it, and always assume as a prerequisite for them supreme wills, of which these rights are but expressions in practice. Therefore, the ideal situation is a situation in which the legislative authority is the gathering of the entire people. Rousseau returns in practice from a structural perspective to Hobbes, while having a different approach to the basic values of society. He returns exactly to that same apparently unclear conclusion I noted above in the chapter discussing public officialdom, in the sense that individuals give all their power and all their natural rights to the sovereign. But in a way fundamentally different from Hobbes, this sovereign is not different from its subjects. The people gives its power to itself and not to a specific different personality. The citizens are the sovereign and the subject alike. From here, it also follows that the same will which is embodied in Locke in the legislative authority, and which did not lead to liberty and equality, must be not the sum of the private wills, which leads to a selfish will, but the sum of the private wills subtracting their wills directed to their private affairs, that is, the sum of their collective wills, and in other words, the general will. The laws in their precise sense are but the conditions of civil participation. The people subject to the laws needs to be their creator. Rousseau accepts, therefore, Locke's position regarding the supremacy of the legislation of laws in the sense of expressing the people's will for the benefit of the people, which reaches optimality with necessary changes for different societies when it is directed toward two supreme goals, liberty and equality. But he opposes in principle the creation of a mechanism of authorities within the framework of the social contract for the purpose of executing this will, since the matter does not stand in line with the base of the social contract, that is, the existence of the general will, and it constitutes a cover for the rule of the will of such and other individuals over the people. The government, the leaders, the executive authority, are not an authority with a sovereign dimension like in Montesquieu. The monarch does not constitute a separate authority from the legislator, but similar to Hobbes, he is nothing but an official of the sovereign, but this time the official of the people. However, here Rousseau naturally falls into a problem. While for Hobbes, who sees a specific personality as sovereign, there is no logical difficulty to argue that all those executing the will of the sovereign are officials. The people is a non-specific personality with very many participants. The people in modern times can hardly convene at all, let alone in a constant manner, to decide on its fate. Furthermore, by the nature of things, there is also no possibility that the entire people will execute its laws, for the natural course of things is that the execution required for changing and special conditions of the general laws be done by a specific personality. Rousseau recognizes that a true rule of the people was never present, and will never be present. The natural order opposes that the majority should manage and the minority be managed. It cannot be imagined that the people stay in a constant assembly to attend to the affairs of the whole. It is clear that if it appoints for this purpose committees, the form of management will necessarily change. And besides, how numerous are the conditions difficult to unite for those demanding to establish such a government? First, a very small state in which it is possible to gather the people easily. Second, a great simplicity in morals, likely to prevent the multiplicity of affairs and the dangerous debates. Third, a high measure of equality in social status and property, without which equality of rights and authority will not last. And finally, the minority of luxuries or their complete absence. For luxuries are the fruit of wealth, or they make wealth a thing that is a necessity. Luxuries corrupt both the rich and the poor, the one by property and the other by envy. They deliver the homeland into the hands of comforts and the vanities of the world. They rob the state of all its citizens and enslave them to one another, and all of them together to public opinion. And for this reason, one of the famous writers set good morals as a fundamental principle of the Republic, because all these conditions do not exist without the good morals. Rousseau's institutional conclusion for the gap between the desirable and the existing is in practice the cancellation of the division of authorities in accordance with the division of social layers. The estates, let alone in all that concerns the legislative authority, which will be identified with the people's will, the strengthening of the legislative authority by determining its constant gathering dependent on the law and not on the decision of the executive authority, the determination of the status of the representatives in the legislative authority as officials of the people, subject to its authority and not vice versa. The weakening of the executive authority by its division. The establishment of a tribune which shall be entrusted with preserving the proportions between the parts of the government, and more. The authority, according to Rousseau, is, therefore, that same institution entrusted with expressing the sovereign's will and its execution, and this within the framework of the purpose of the social contract, that is, the principles of liberty and equality. Since the people individuals are the sovereign and the subject alike, then in an ideal way, there is no place for the existence of an authority, since the sovereign people needs to express its will and execute it itself, and not through individuals who are liable by the nature of things to be required to their own will, and not act according to the general will properly. Furthermore, a social regime divided into several authorities necessarily means division into several sovereigns, in a way that contradicts both in itself and due to its necessary result, the basis of the social contract, that is, the existence of the general will of the sovereign, the people, the individuals, and them only. Since in a practical way, the people cannot rule itself without an authority, effort should be made for a division of authorities whose source of power shall be the people only, without division into estates, to act to strengthen the power and influence of the legislative authority, to weaken the executive authority, among other things, by dividing it into departments, and for the existence of an additional institution outside the city, which is not an authority but is not subject to the authorities. This body, the tribune, shall be entrusted with the guard of the correct proportions between the authorities themselves and between them and the citizens. Rousseau proceeded and was prior to the French Revolution. His ideas constituted a ground for the cancellation of the old estates assembly, for the cancellation of the legal classes, the estates, for the establishment of the People's Assembly as the supreme institution in the state, for the cancellation of the status of the nobility, and of course the monarch, for the rule of the citizens themselves over themselves as one supreme and single authority operating citizens, as officials executing the people's will. Rousseau recognizes that a true rule of the people was never present, and will never be present. The natural order opposes that the majority should manage and the minority be managed. It cannot be imagined that the people stay in a constant assembly to attend to the affairs of the whole. It is clear that if it appoints for this purpose committees, the form of management will necessarily change. And besides, how numerous are the conditions difficult to unite for those demanding to establish such a government? First, a very small state in which it is possible to gather the people easily. Second, a great simplicity in morals, likely to prevent the multiplicity of affairs and the dangerous debates. Third, a high measure of equality in social status and property, without which equality of rights and authority will not last. And finally, the minority of luxuries or their complete absence. For luxuries are the fruit of wealth, or they make wealth a thing that is a necessity. Luxuries corrupt both the rich and the poor, the one by property and the other by envy. They deliver the homeland into the hands of comforts and the vanities of the world. They rob the state of all its citizens and enslave them to one another, and all of them together to public opinion. And for this reason, one of the famous writers set good morals as a fundamental principle of the Republic, because all these conditions do not exist without the good morals. Rousseau's institutional conclusion for the gap between the desirable and the existing is in practice the cancellation of the division of authorities in accordance with the division of social layers. The estates, let alone in all that concerns the legislative authority, which will be identified with the people's will, the strengthening of the legislative authority by determining its constant gathering dependent on the law and not on the decision of the executive authority, the determination of the status of the representatives in the legislative authority as officials of the people, subject to its authority and not vice versa, the weakening of the executive authority by its division, the establishment of a tribune which shall be entrusted with preserving the proportions between the parts of the government, and more. The authority, according to Rousseau, is, therefore, that same institution entrusted with expressing the sovereign's will and its execution, and this within the framework of the purpose of the social contract, that is, the principles of liberty and equality. Since the people individuals are the sovereign and the subject alike, then in an ideal way, there is no place for the existence of an authority, since the sovereign people needs to express its will and execute it itself, and not through individuals who are liable by the nature of things to be required to their own will, and not act according to the general will properly. Furthermore, a social regime divided into several authorities necessarily means division into several sovereigns, in a way that contradicts both in itself and due to its necessary result, the basis of the social contract, that is, the existence of the general will of the sovereign, the people, the individuals, and them only. Since in a practical way, the people cannot rule itself without an authority, effort should be made for a division of authorities whose source of power shall be the people only, without division into estates, to act to strengthen the power and influence of the legislative authority, to weaken the executive authority, among other things, by dividing it into departments, and for the existence of an additional institution outside the city, which is not an authority but is not subject to the authorities. This body, the tribune, shall be entrusted with the guard of the correct proportions between the authorities themselves and between them and the citizens. Rousseau preceded and was prior to the French Revolution. His ideas constituted a ground for the cancellation of the old estates assembly, for the cancellation of the legal classes, the estates, for the establishment of the People's Assembly as the supreme institution in the state, for the cancellation of the status of the nobility, and of course the monarch, for the rule of the citizens themselves over themselves as one supreme and single authority operating citizens, as officials executing the people's will.
Hegel. The authority as an institutional, universal, objective actuality of the principle of total liberty.
Among those who lived during the French Revolution and after it, there were those who saw the concentration of power in the hands of one authority, ostensibly identified with the people, as a stunning historical attempt, but at the same time a failure expressed, among other things, in the severe terror that accompanied it, and in the rise of a tyrant to power. This alleged failure served, apparently, as historical proof that Rousseau's proposal returned society to a state of chaos, to internal terror and continuous external wars, to Hobbes's state of nature. To overcome these aspects of identifying the sovereign with the people from a philosophical perspective, and the establishment of the state as a single civil society which led to this situation, Hegel sought to propose a fundamental correction to Rousseau's proposal, while accepting some of his conceptual innovations. Hegel begins his attack on Rousseau from that same innovation of Rousseau, which remained without a real answer, and that is the question of the essence of the general will, the question of the philosophical interpretation of liberty, which Rousseau leaves unanswered, as well as that same problematic identity between the sovereign citizen and the subject citizen. This problem concerns the objective substantive characteristic of the general will, of the public good which is not dependent on such or another private view. According to Rousseau, the general will is derived from the private will of the individual, from the sum of private wills while neutralizing their selfish aspects, a thing which is proven in Hegel's opinion as impossible from both a practical and theoretical perspective. The individual who is naturally driven by selfish motives cannot be the source for the good of the whole, which is objective in its essence, and hence it is by definition opposed, antagonistic by definition, to the private will, which is selfish by nature. From this it follows that the right standing at the base of the society's existence is a liberty of a different type from the one reflected in Rousseau's thought. This is the liberty of the individual derived and stemming from his free will, in the sense that it includes a subjective dimension in which the I is a pure reflection into itself, and an objective existential external dimension to the individual, in which the I is a transformation from being a changing and undifferentiated factor into an imperishable, fixed, distinct external objective factor in the face of the subjective essence of the individual. From here, it also follows that the single individual cannot be at the same time both the subject and the sovereign, as Rousseau claimed, since the element at the base of establishing the sovereign is free will, or universal liberty, which unites within it two separate elements, subjective and objective, which cannot be implemented from the same source, from the individuals. From this basic change, it follows that a separation must be made between the general spheres of the will of all and the general will as understood by Rousseau. Rousseau's will of all is expressed within the framework of that same subjective universal sphere characterized by the will of individuals, in which the wills of individuals are expressed in a way that is subjective, selfish particular of each and every individual, and regarding the need to allow action of this type in a universal manner. This is the civil society, which is fundamentally different from that same sphere embodying, according to Rousseau, the general will, which is objective, universal. On the other hand, and in a complementary manner, the objective sphere does not depend at all on the subjective internal will of the individual. It is not the result of a social contract, but an essence existing in itself and by itself. It is not the sum of the private wills while subtracting their selfish wills, a thing which does not exist in practice, but it is an objective sphere disconnected from the wills of the individuals in themselves. It is the state and its institutions.
Just as the free will is characterized by a subjective dimension and an objective dimension, which are separate and opposed but complement each other into one comprehensive unity, so too society is not composed of a single sphere of civil society. Civil society is vital to the existence of society, just as the private subjective will is part of its essence. But it is antagonistic by definition to that same complementary part of the essence of free will, which is the objective will, and in a comprehensive manner, the state authorities acting in a universal objective manner, which is what determines the good of the entire public, separately from the wills of the individuals. The importance of Hegel's institutional conclusion for our purposes is precisely because of the radicalness in it relative to the institutional conclusions of thinkers who preceded him, such as Locke and Rousseau, and the structure of authorities accepted in democratic liberal society. Hegel's position regarding the structure of the state and its authorities is strikingly different from that of Rousseau. The subjective, particular dimension of the free will of individuals receives its satisfaction in the sphere of civil society, within which individuals act in accordance with their particular interests toward each other, to exhaust their personal welfare, their pleasure, etc. This action receives a universal dimension in that all individuals must be allowed to maintain this will of theirs to act in accordance with their own interests, and this through institutions within the framework of civil society and the universal institutions of the state. As for the universal, objective dimension of the free will, which discusses the good of the whole, the collective of all individuals, then in total contrast to Rousseau, this dimension is extracted in an extreme manner from the individual's authority and transferred to a series of institutions through which Hegel claims that same objective, universal dimension can be reached. The particular authorities are derived from the essence of the state, from its substantive unity in a way that is parallel to an organic body, which is an inseparable unity. The authorities possess identical goals of action in this respect, that they are defined by the goal of the whole complete, as well as mutual preservation of the other authorities, while exhausting their own function through suitable institutions. The primary authority is the one expressing the totality, the unity of the state, on its subjective and objective foundations, and it is embodied by the monarch. This is a subjective entity acting in a universal manner for the benefit of all citizens. According to Hegel, it can be argued that the election of the monarch by the citizens should be allowed. Perhaps he is aiming at the presidential regime in the United States, but he believes, as he will also argue later regarding the other authorities, that this possibility is bad, since it links the subjective will of the citizens with an essence which is supposed to be universal in a total manner. The subjective will of the citizens is an arbitrary, capricious personal will, which has weight and expression within the framework of civil society, but not in the state. When the particular will chooses the unifying personality, then the result is that the authorities become private property, and the sovereignty of the state is weakened and lost.
Therefore, it is fitting to prefer a monarch who receives his position by virtue of constitutional inheritance, in a way that is completely disconnected from the subjective affairs of the individuals and of the other components of the state. The monarch disconnected from subjective considerations is the sovereign and not the people. The expressions of the state's totality, its unity, its moments, its sovereignty, are embodied in that same individual, in the monarch. The roles of the sovereign embody the unity and totality of his status toward the rest of the parts of the state, and they include the pardoning of criminals, the appointment and dismissal of the highest advisors in the state, and caring for the existence of the universal aspect of the state in itself, and for itself through the Constitution and the laws as a whole. After the monarch comes the matter of the executive authority. This authority is, according to Hegel, the one which executes the decisions of the sovereign, and which is the continuation of the implementation and preservation of previous decisions, existing laws, institutions, and arrangements for the promotion of common goals that are separate from the decisions themselves. It deals with the transition from the universal of the state to the particular and the private, and its functions need to be divided according to different branches for the purpose of maintaining this goal. The executive authority includes, according to Hegel, the judicial system and the police, which have a more immediate reference to the particular affairs of civil society. The particular common interests found in civil society, beyond the universal interest of the state, are managed by corporations representing the communities and the professions, as well as by the estates, through their institutions that supervise and manage these affairs. On one hand, the goal of these institutions is to guard private property and the interests of these particular spheres, and their operation is based on the trust given to them by the citizens members in them. And on the other hand, they must be subject to higher universal interests of the state. The distancing of the masses people, the individual's persons from direct influence regarding the operation of the universal interest of the state, receives its final and explicit seal in Hegel's analysis regarding the legislative authority, which is the central institution in Locke and Rousseau expressing the will of individuals. It seems that leaving the legislative authority to the end of the analysis of the state's institutions within the framework of the internal constitution is not accidental. Hegel continues here too, regarding the other authorities, his clear trend toward the disconnection of the people individuals from direct institutional political influence in the state's affairs, toward the distancing of the individuals, the masses, from the state's sphere as much as only possible. The role of the legislative authority, at its definitional level, is to deal with laws in the sense of new and additional determinations in the state's affairs related to this, which are general and universal. This authority is part of the Constitution which is prior to it, and which exists in itself and for itself outside the sphere given to influence by the legislative authority. The legislative authority operates according to Hegel through the estates by their assemblies, and this in order to bring the universal interest into the existence of subjective liberty, as an empirical universality of the opinions and thoughts of the many. The first part of the legislative authority is found in the assembly of landowners, and in practice in the assembly of the old nobility, whose ethical base is on one hand in family life, and on the other hand in the ownership of landed property. The political universality of this class is made possible since in its possession are such assets that allow it autonomy, a more secure and more stable status than that of the owners of other assets from the field of commerce, for example, whose status is not secure and is derived from the insecure pursuit of profit. On the other hand, those nobles or landowners are independent relative to the executive authority and relative to the masses alike, because of their economic situation and status. Conversely, they are less free, in Hegel's opinion, than the rest of the citizens, since they are not permitted to give up all their property as they wish, and are not permitted to transfer them to whom they desire, as they are limited by the right of inheritance, the right of primogeniture, which is neutral from influences, and its source is in birth alone. The second part of the legislative authority is found in the assembly of representatives of the rest of the people, and it contains the changing element of civil society. These representatives are chosen by civil society, and through them, society behaves as it truly is. This class is permitted to choose its representatives to the legislative authority at the request of the sovereign authority, and together with the First Assembly, the existence of these estates and their assemblies is guaranteed through the law. The goal of choosing the representatives is to give credit to whoever has a better understanding of the universal affairs than the voter. The intention is not that these elected ones will subject the universal interest to the particular interest of the community or the corporation. Their status is not as elected agent emissaries, especially since the goal of their assembly is to maintain a deep discussion in which the participants guide and convince each other. Hegel continues and emphasizes that this representation means that influence is not given to each individual directly, but through qualified representatives. In absolute and blunt contrast to Rousseau's view, the individual is no longer involved in universal decisions, but his representative. This representative is obligated to action possessing a universal dimension, and therefore his qualifications are required to include the knowledge regarding the interests and institutions of the state and civil society alike. This knowledge is acquired by him through the management of businesses in a position of authority within the framework of civil society, or by performing a public office whose quality was proven in practice. External qualifications required from the representative are, for example, a certain ownership of property. The concept of authority, according to Hegel, is fundamentally different from the thinkers detailed above. The authority is the institutional universal objective actuality of the social supreme principle, total liberty, as distinguished from civil society on its institutions, which is the actuality of the citizen's will, of the subjective universal aspect of total liberty. The source of the authority's power is not in the sovereign as a certain or uncertain personality, but in the ideal, in the total liberty coming into actual expression in the comprehensive and harmonious state, existing by itself and in itself. The manner of division into authorities stems from the essence of the state itself and in itself, from the objective universal dimension of the principle of liberty standing at its base, and whose substantive organic unity stems from its comprehensive meaning. The goal of the authorities is identical in this respect, that they are defined by the goal of the social whole complete, as well as the need for mutual preservation of the other authorities, while exhausting their particular functions through suitable institutions.
Weber and the special means for the action of the authority.
After I have reviewed various perceptions regarding the concept of authority, from aspects of the purpose of society and sovereignty, and before I address my position regarding the definition of the concept of authority as a derivative of these perceptions, and the answer to the question posed at the beginning of this chapter, it is appropriate to address the concept of authority in terms of the special means for the action of the supreme institutions in society. The authority for violence. The accepted general sociological definition regarding the state and its institutions is that the state stands on violence, or, in the words of Max Weber, without entering into issues of purpose. A state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Weber, 1962. The use of violence, according to him, is not the only method for managing political groups and corporations whose heads use all conceivable means to achieve their goals. However, within this, the threat of force and, if necessary, the actual use of force is the method specific to political associations, and it is always the last resort when other means fail. The manner in which a monopoly on violence can be achieved and maintained embodies within it issues of power and authority, whose subject is the requirement to obtain legitimacy for the purpose of successful monopolistic use or the possibility of use of violence, this under the assumption that this monopoly shall not be established on fear alone. From a sociological perspective of the analysis of the definition of the state, focusing on the means specific to it, the obtaining of authority, the legitimacy for the monopoly on violence, originates, according to Weber, in three. In principle, there are three inner justifications which grant the right to permitted rule. The first is the authority of custom. This is traditional rule, such as that held by the patriarch or the patrimonial governor according to the old order. The arguments for accepting legitimate authority here rely on an accepted belief in the sanctity of tradition from time immemorial. The second justification is the authority of the personal gift of grace, charisma, the extraordinary, of devotion and dedication and belief in revelations of the divine, in heroism, or in other qualities of a unique individual. The arguments for accepting authority here rely on devotion to the sanctity or specific exceptional heroism of a single man or in his exemplary character, and on the patterns or the normative order revealed or commanded by him. Obedience to the leader as such stems from the power of trust in him and in his revelation, in his heroism, and in his proven qualities. And finally, there is rule by virtue of legality, by virtue of belief in the power of laws and judgments, and of the fields of substantive authority, delimited by rational rules. Here, the arguments for authority rely on belief in legality, patterns of normative rules, and the right of those elevated to rule according to these rules to issue orders. Here, a person owes obedience to an impersonal regime established by law. This obedience is valid regarding people exercising authority within it only by virtue of the normative legality of their orders, and only within the scope of the role's authority. These types, according to Weber, are vital for understanding the structure of rule. To my taste, the legitimate justification for that discipline and subordination necessarily encounter those same three pure types. And the importance of these images of justifications and their reasons and arguments is very great for the structure of rule. Weber notes that in order to maintain rule established on violence, there is a need for a continuous and binding administration. That is, in people who obey the ruler and claim permitted rule, and in the use of properties and assets required when necessary to maintain that same permitted violence. The authority of the state's institutions stems, therefore, according to Weber, typically from tradition and/or charisma and/or legality, found in the hands of the ruler and the administration operating to implement his decisions. Although it can, in my opinion, be argued that in the modern state there exists a dichotomy mainly between two main justifications for building the governing institutions, and they are charisma and rational legality. Weber asks us, in indirect language, to avoid within a sociological analysis the requirement of the state's purpose, and argues in practice that the common denominator for examining social relations for the definition of the state is the means only: violence. Even the state cannot be defined sociologically by the content of the acts it performs. There is almost no role that a political association does not take upon itself here and there. And on the other hand, there is almost no role and function of which one can decide and say that it is always specific. Indeed, the modern state can be defined sociologically only by the specific means, unique to it, as to every political association, by violence. Every state is founded on force, said Trotsky at Brest-Litovsk. Indeed, such is the case. However, it can, in my opinion, be argued that those same types he presents to us for the justification of the use of the monopoly on violence, those standing at the base of the establishment of the state's institutions, that is, the charismatic, the traditional, and the legal rational, always rely in their action on a general normative historical purpose, which is not subject to change in regular political processes, that is, the public good, the good of the people, the general will, or the universal dimension of free will, and so on and so forth in their comprehensive constitutional meaning. Conversely, it is clear that the basis of their formal action and the justification of its legitimacy cannot rely on purely private justifications. General purpose is a comprehensive, normative, philosophical, historical characteristic of a given society. a leader, as charismatic as he may be, who will claim the need for absolute rule in a society in which liberal democracy is rooted, will not be able at all to claim his claims, let alone will not reach power at all, or will not survive in power for long. And vice versa, a charismatic leader, as he may be, who will claim in a society where absolute monarchy is familiar and rooted for the need to establish a democratic society, his rule will not be established, and his way to achieve for himself a position of monopoly on violence will not succeed, let alone in a stable manner. Such is also the case regarding the traditional leader or institution, let alone the one acting by virtue of rational law. For on one hand, to the extent that each and every one of the seekers of authority will seek in a formal way to receive or preserve his authority because of his private affairs or the private affair of a certain group, his days as ruler are not many. And such is also the case if he acts or seeks to receive authority contrary to the accepted general purpose of that society, to its fundamental values, and this out of an agreed assumption that not on fear alone and not on irrational means shall rule be established. From a sociological perspective, and without addressing the specific meaning of that same general purpose of a given society, it can therefore be argued that it constitutes, alongside the means of violence, a common denominator concerning the infrastructure of obtaining authority and establishing institutions in society. That same justification of which Weber speaks regarding the acquisition of the monopoly on violence. It can therefore be argued that there is no possibility for the existence of the legitimacy of the authority standing at the base of the establishment of the authority without the existence of this purpose. But in order to define what that same purpose is, which is accepted in the society as a whole, we must address the general basic principles of the specific society.
The concept of authority. Conclusions and application to our matter.
From the various perceptions regarding the concept of authority detailed above, a common dimension for the concept of authority in the liberal democratic state can now be extracted. It seems that at the basic level, hereinafter the narrow sense, it can be said that the authority in itself is an institution intended to express and execute the supreme principles within the will of the non-specific sovereign, or, in parallel, the actualization of the universal objective dimension of the social ideal. The division into several authorities is the practical expression of the comprehensive essence of the authority. Already from observing the narrow sense of the authority, as well as its essence as a central social historical institution with a broad philosophical historical source and extensive influence, it seems that the meaning of the authority must be examined in a broad sense, namely, according to its relative context to the basic components of the state, that is, the identity of the sovereign, the identity of the supreme principles in society, and the characterization of the means and areas of action of the authority. Regarding the broad sense of the concept of authority, it is appropriate, in my opinion, to address the integration between the extreme approaches of Rousseau and Hegel, in the sense of extremes requiring a bridge, in the spirit of moderation characterizing Locke and the conclusions of Montesquieu, with necessary changes, that is, not an exclusive emphasis on the identity of the sovereign, and conversely, exclusivity to the universal objective dimension of the social supreme principle, but a combination of the two. The authorities are therefore independent institutions, in the flexible sense, entrusted with the existence of the supreme principles of society, which in the democratic liberal state are substantive equality and liberty, through the expression and execution of the ongoing will of the non-specific sovereign, which in this state is the people individuals. The source of the authority's power is therefore integrated and includes the social constitutional supreme principles and the will of the sovereign people alike. The special means for the action of the authorities as a whole is the use, or the possibility of monopolistic use, of violence in society, and it is given to the authority as a deposit and as a means for the preservation and application of the supreme principles in society. The accepted types of the authority's means are legislation, execution, and adjudication. From a structural standpoint, this means that the enormous power given to all authorities must not be concentrated in one authority. The authorities must be separate in such a way that they check one another and restrain one another, so that an opportunity for action for the benefit of a specific sector or personality, contrary to the required universal dimension of their action, is not created, and also that their division will give practical expression to the supreme principles of society. The meaning of the definition of the authority from a philosophical perspective is that the specific manner of the division of authorities is not a fixed and sacred thing, and even conversely, that this division must be derived in the optimal way possible for the purpose of society and the identity of the sovereign alike. This as distinguished from sovereignty in itself, which is indivisible, and as distinguished from a division characterized by the type of means alone. From here it follows that this division is subject to change given a social reality which does not allow for the integrated existence of the supreme principles and/or the existence of the sovereign's will, let alone in an extreme manner as claimed in this work. It is not the procedure that is the center, nor the means, but the essence, all the individuals, the people and the principles of liberty, and substantive equality found at the base of their social gathering or in themselves. The authority is therefore an institutional auxiliary means for the existence of the collective will of the sovereign, the purpose of the social structure in which it is found, and the rights stemming from it. And in order to escape from a situation in which the process rules the sovereign, it is perhaps appropriate to turn to a solution that is both procedural and substantive alike. A situation in which a real fear exists of an unbalanced concentration of power in the hands of such or another specific sector, or in the hands of a certain authority that does not express the will of the people and the comprehensive purpose of society, is the true injury to sovereignty. Such is the situation, for example, during the increase of the executive authority's power or the strengthening of one supreme principle at the expense of another. Here, action must be taken to strengthen the influence of the people over its fate, for example through strengthening its power in the legislative authority and weakening the executive authority by its division, as well as to strengthen the execution of the weakened supreme principle. And now to our matter. From the definition of the concept of authority, I learned that the recommendation presented before us to change the structure of the authorities in society is not only possible, but it is even required where the existing structure contradicts the comprehensive purpose of society and distances the sovereign from the possibility of deciding regarding its fate and its path. A situation of this type lies before us in this work, namely, an ever-increasing control of the owners of wealth over society and, conversely, the socio-economic weakening of the rest of the population, which constitutes its vast and decisive majority. The weakening of the power and influence of the people over the shaping of its fate. The formation of the privatized state, which sheds its social responsibility, is subject to the influence of the owners of wealth, and is engaged in the creation and maintenance of the conditions that allow their ever-increasing intensification. This situation stands in contradiction with at least one of the two supreme principles, namely, the principle of substantive equality, and in my opinion, with both of them together. A basic assumption in this work is that the sovereign in the democratic liberal society is the entire people, the individuals, and that the purpose of this society is composed of two opposing but complementary supreme principles, liberty and substantive equality. A governmental structure within the framework of the liberal democratic society which maintains or seeks to maintain both supreme principles with equal status, as well as the ongoing will of the sovereign, and not only or mainly of the top percentile of it, possesses in a general definitional way a deeper and more comprehensive reference to the interest of the entire public than another structure that does not maintain them together and with equal status. These things are also true where in the existing structure there is a clear preference for one supreme principle at the expense of the other, for practical and other reasons. Therefore, from a general philosophical perspective, the establishment of a fourth, social authority, in which the principle of substantive equality is the guiding principle of its operation, under the assumption that the existing authorities establish the existence of the principle of liberty, and which will serve to strengthen the voice and interest of the vast majority of the people, namely, the weak and middle socio-economic layers, is consistent with the base of the general purpose of the democratic liberal state and the identity of the sovereign, and even establishes them against the existing regime situation. In this context, it can be further argued that the current state structure focuses in a formal and weakened way on the formal identity of the sovereign people, and on one supreme principle, which is the principle of subjective negative liberty. The division of authorities into legislative, executive, and judicial in itself, including the principle of their independence and separation, which does not exist in practice, as I will clarify later, let alone in a reality of the privatization of the state and the unrestrained intensification of the owners of wealth, perhaps allows for the formal existence of negative liberty, but conversely leaves its positive component, namely, the principle of substantive equality, orphaned, in a way that is not of equal status to its counterpart. Furthermore, even the claim according to which the establishment of the fourth authority means addressing the interest of a certain class over the interest of other classes, such as ethnic, national, gender, etc., is not acceptable to me at all. From a sociological perspective, it can be argued, according to the determination of Max Weber, that there are no classes in society except for the socio-economic classes, and that a distinction must be made between classes and different social layers. Classes are not communities. They only represent possible bases and belong to communal action. We may speak of a class when a number of people have in common a specific causal component of their life chances, insofar as this component is represented exclusively by economic interests, including goods and opportunities for income, and 3, it is represented under the conditions of the commodity or labor markets, which we can express more briefly as the typical chance for the supply of goods, external living conditions, and personal life experiences. When this chance is determined by the amount and kind of power, or lack of it, to obtain goods or skills for income in a given economic order. The term class refers to any group of people found in the same class situation. And furthermore, property and lack of property are, therefore, the basic categories of all class situations. It is not important whether these two categories are expressed in a price war or in competitive struggles. The meaning of the concept class is always this: that the kind of chance in the market is the decisive moment embodying a common condition for the individual's fate. In this test, class situation is ultimately market situation. According to our term, the factor creating class is unequivocally the economic interest. In contrast to classes, status groups are generally communities. In contrast to the class situation determined in an economic way only, we wish to define as status situation every typical component of the life fate of human beings determined by a specific social evaluation, whether positive or negative, of honor. Therefore, it can definitely be argued that as a yardstick for the division of society into parts composing one whole totality, one cannot address, especially in the modern era, anything but the socio-economic classes, which include all the various communities and statuses. Consequently, one cannot establish a basic political authority for a certain community, something which would drag countless demands for the establishment of an authority for another community, and so on, and which is contrary to the necessary universal dimension of the state's authorities. But it is certainly possible to argue, according to the principle of the state's generality, for the need for the establishment of an authority that will bring about a correction in the state's relation and its responsibility to all socio-economic classes in society. Furthermore, the socio-economic classes are a non-specific social division which exists and will exist in the free society, if only for the reason that human beings are different in their abilities, in their skills, in their vigor. However, unbearable gaps between the vast majority of the population and a minority of owners of wealth, which have implications in all fields of life, private and public, of the entire population, will eventually turn these non-specific classes into fixed social layers, similar to those that existed on the eve of the French Revolution. Severe gaps are liable to turn the non-specific classes, which a person in an enlightened society is supposed to be able to enter and exit freely, due to the equal opportunity found in his path, according to his skills, ability, and vigor, and not according to his origin, into specific and fixed classes, whose existence a free and democratic society cannot and must not allow under any circumstances. Therefore, it can be argued that constant institutional action within the framework of the state authorities, even in situations that are not extreme, and whose subject is the granting of constant equal opportunity to the entire population on the socio-economic level, in the reduction of gaps between these classes without injury to the aspects of the principle of liberty, in action according to the principle of substantive equality, when it is restrained and integrated with the other authorities, possesses specifically a compatibility with the concept of authority more than the absence of action of this type.
It is clear that the consequential derivative of action of this type is help for the weaker classes in society, and so be it. This is, after all, a clear derivative of action according to the principle of substantive equality. Can a claim be seriously accepted according to which the supreme principles of the democratic liberal society necessitate, encourage, and even do not contradict a situation in which a very few are found in constant and unrestrained intensification in all fields of their life and influence, while the vast majority of the public goes from bad to worse? Is this a universal, fair, and proper action of the state and its authorities, especially if an alternative possible for it exists? It seems to me that it can definitely be argued that the establishment of the fourth social authority does not mean the setting up of an authority for such or another social layer, but the application of the integrated concept of authority, namely, its being entrusted with the comprehensive purpose of society, with the principles of liberty and substantive equality in an equal status manner, while granting a more proper possibility for the existence of the will of the entire sovereign to come into a more proper and true expression. And as has already been said, where the institutional structure of the authorities allows preference of one of the two supreme principles in society over the other, and/or causes a preference in practice of such or another sector, let alone that it constitutes a minute part of the population, there is conceptual room for the claim regarding the need for its change, for example, through a change of the type of adding the fourth social authority. This change is fitting to operate in the democratic liberal society for the actual exhaustion of both supreme principles together, for the strengthening of the power of all citizens and the corrective weakening of the control of the few owners of wealth over the general public.